everyone, and welcome back to the Internet Report, where we uncover what's working and what's breaking on the internet, and why. The financial services sector is undergoing transformation to meet increasing customer demand for digitised forms of engagement. This week, we're discussing the EU's Digital Operational Resilience Act, known as DORA, which is coming into effect in only a few months. It aims to strengthen the IT security of financial entities such as banks, insurance companies, and investment firms. We'll discuss the impact for organisations inside and outside of the EU, steps companies can take to prepare, and more. We'll also close with our usual roundup of recent outage events. I'm Barry Collins, and as usual, I'm joined by Mike Hicks, Principal Solutions Analyst at Cisco ThousandEyes. Today, we also have with us Bernie Clairmont, Product Solutions Architect at Cisco ThousandEyes, who spent a lot of time thinking about DORA and what it means for digital operations and resilience. As always, we included chapters in the episode description below, so you can skip ahead to the sections that are most interesting to you. And if you haven't already, we'd love you to take a moment to give us a follow over at Spotify, Apple Podcasts, or wherever you like to listen. Let's crack on with the show, and I started by asking Bernie to tell us about his role at Cisco ThousandEyes and why he spent so much time focusing on DORA recently.
Sure. So I'm a product solutions architect at ThousandEyes. And, my role really is around assuring digital resilience, how to help organizations so they can assure quality digital experiences for their users and their services that are critical to their business. DORA raises a lot of interesting questions around this, has implications around the digital resilience and assurance of those experiences. And so happy to have a conversation about that. I've been doing quite a bit of research on it for quite a while.
Can you tell us more about DORA, Bernie, and why all ITOps teams should be aware of it?
If you read through the regulation, it's really long and it repeats a lot. But, ultimately, it has multiple pillars that are defined around the act that goes into effect in January 2025. The real stated goal is around how to strengthen the IT security of financial entities, such as banks, insurance companies, investment firms, things like that. Really, it helps them be able to have that visibility into those services and provides them a framework around that. But it's a comprehensive program that assures that digital operational resilience of critical ICT systems. So when we say ICT, really that's information and communication technology around the risk management. So a lot of times there's a bunch of acronyms. You add those in and then people start getting lost. But those services could be third-party vendors, services like that for payment processing. When you go to use your credit card, there's a bunch of services that happen in the back end to make that happen. Or you go to the ATM, withdraw money. Those services are reliant on a lot of things that are outside of the bank's control today. And so assuring that, finding bottlenecks, making sure that their network and their services are really up to snuff, for lack of a better term, and assure you have a good baseline associated with that. Another piece of it, I think, that comes into play as well is as you test failovers of those services and what that looks like when an issue happens. So say, for example, you have a denial of service like a DDoS attack or things like that. Is my mitigation service actually functioning or is it failing and falling down? So being able to assure those things, be able to report on that as well to show how that works and share that out to within the industry, within your own organization or to the regulators and things like that. I don't know, Mike, do you have a couple other things to add there around those digital services and resilience?
Yeah, absolutely. There's a couple of things you said there. So first of all, let's sort of stay where we're talking about DORA. We're talking very specifically about an act that is going to come in play for Europe. So this is a European one. So sort of we're talking about the financial institutions based in Europe there. Although in terms of thinking outside of that, if you're talking that things are like data sovereignty, data residency, there's various areas. So, but the predominantly in terms of enforcement is in Europe there. Then you also mentioned a couple of things where we're talking about resilience and assurance. So I like to kind of categorize resilience as, let's say, keeping the lights on. So, we're talking about high availability. We want things to be up and available when we're there. When we want to draw money out, we want to be able to have it there. When I want to do online banking to pay someone, it's got to be there. So that's what I see as resilience. And we do that by providing backup circuits and then sort of having these alternate systems. So with that mitigation plans, you talked about DDoS mitigation, these things to keep things available. Then on the other side of that is the assurance aspect of it. And I believe you can't have one without the other. So to assure a service is going to be resilient as well. So when we talk about assurance, we're talking about basically, if you like, sort of not guaranteeing per se, but assuring that we're going to be able to have that connectivity. So then this goes to things like your backup services. Is it there? Is it working? It's no good just sort of kind of having it sitting there. Yep, we've tested it once. You got to make sure that when something does occur, we can kick over to it. So I think it's all of that. And then also, one of the things we have to be aware of is that outages are inevitable. So what you've got to do is kind of reduce that impact. And this is essentially what I believe the Act is doing, and certainly where sort of that visibility and that assurance aspect can sort of help from.
Tell us more about the impact that DORA will have on EU organisations and what it might mean for firms outside of the EU as well.
Yeah, I think some of the things outside of the EU, as you think about it, again, these third-party services a lot of times are outside. And so being able to trace what that looks like and what that network connectivity looks like, as well as baseline those services. I found a few times where, you'll see failovers happen that all of a sudden your service goes from being a 20 millisecond service to now several seconds in response time. And that can cause timeouts of applications or different microservices and things like that. Or you'll see like a service provider will do maintenance and all of a sudden that path takes an entire different path that goes halfway around the world to get to what that service is. And ThousandEyes does a really good job about showing what that connectivity looks like, as well as the network providers that the actual network is taking. So understanding the traffic in flight and, those kind of pieces, as well as, hey, is this a hijack or is this, something that was maintenance or things like that? Being able to combine that, or did routes converge? So our BGP piece really helps out a ton with that, of being able to see what that looks like from a peering provided perspective.
Something you mentioned there, Bernie, is we're talking about services here. So, we're used to talking about individual functions or features. We're talking about a network connection. We're talking about back-end service. You mentioned microservices there. When we're looking at here, we're talking about an overall service that underneath that, there could be different dependencies. So this is then we're talking about the potential to have stuff sort of outside. So I might be using some sort of payment gateway that is distributed around the world. So again, if I'm traveling outside of Europe, I need to be able to sort of connect to that. So rather than have to pull all the data back into European there, although again, talk about residency and sovereignty issues, but I'm also then going to be able to have some sort of gateway that sits outside, even though it's still going to come under that third-party service. So it's that connectivity of the overall service, the dependencies and how they work together that is kind of critical, or that we need to understand sort of how they all knit together.
Exactly. It's the ability to visualize that and report on it and be able to show that service health. And having a baseline is really important, because without a baseline, how do you spot an anomaly?
And just because your provider might not be within the EU, you still need to be aware of the DORA regulations and how they might affect your company.
Those services, again, even if they're not in the EU, they create that bottleneck and that potential of, if something occurs with them, they can cause a critical outage. And if you don't know where those services are, they can cause issues. And I've seen some things where, you'll have, say, a page load, for example, and you'll see the different components associated with the page load, and you can start to see where those elements are coming from. And you can also see if there's problems associated with those by just building tests to those components and telling, like, hey, this component is actually coming from an entirely different country than we expect it to be on our page.
Yeah. And then something, again, we talked about the BGP hijacks. We've got numerous examples, and a lot of these aren't malicious, but we could have something that's happening on the other side of the world. We've had an example where there was a route leak rather than hijack, but a BGP route leak that occurred in Australia. It actually impacted a bank in South Africa just because of the way the prefixes were advertised and something like that. So again, something like that could happen. So although in terms of a DORA perspective, it isn't impacted by the regulation or by the Act itself, you also still need to have that understanding of, we're now using the internet as our backbone. We're relying on these services, so we need to have some sort of understanding of how all these components work together and connect in and function.
Yeah, and a lot of times, if you think about API services in general, those can be multiple API transactions. I mean, we have a good blog on that showing like, hey, this API got the authentication token, and then it went to a third-party service that did something else, and then it continues on down the path, which could be multiple different providers just to create one actual transaction that occurs.
I like the fact you brought up APIs there as well, because we're going to that next stage. This is then starting to get into that availability and that assurance, resilience itself. So I'm testing multiple functions within that service. I'm not just saying the front door's up. I'm saying I can actually potentially authenticate, or I'm looking for some sort of assertion to come back. And that helps me understand further into the system, which can only therefore then give me a confidence in that if something is going to break, or I have some sort of issue that occurs there, that I'm actually going to be able to know what steps to take if this component breaks, for example.
Outside of the EU, do other countries have similar regulations? And regardless, it sounds like DORA raises some best practices that might be useful for all ITOps teams, regardless of industry or region.
Yeah, I mean, there's similar legislation in other countries. Financial service regulators in Australia, the US has Federal Reserve. Australia has APRA, I guess is how you'd pronounce it there, down under. and those have also pushed regulations. So it creates that baseline of operational resilience from those regulated firms. And I mean, ultimately, it's really to help organizations just, really nail down how to deliver services in a more responsible and resilient manner and be able to have really good plans for mitigation when things occur. And be able to share that as well with the regulators so that they can quickly understand, like, hey, here's what occurred, here's how it was mitigated, here's what the risk factors are, things like that.
I like that. And coming back again, we're talking about this overall service delivery. And then we think about this concept from a RACI perspective. So the responsible, the accountable, the contracted, and the informational point of view. I, as the financial institute, I have responsibility for the end-to-end service delivery chain, even though I don't have accountability for every component of it. And as you said, some of that might be outside. So what this really is, like you say, it's almost like a best practices guideline. This is what you want to do. We rely on the digital world today. Obviously, we're talking about financial institutions here, but this is applicable outside in terms of a guidelines or a best practice type of approach. And then you can overlay this on top of it. What you want to do is high availability. Now, we've talked in the past where we've had these situations where a payment gateway's gone down and grocery stores can't transact. There is no backup plan. People don't understand cash anymore, so they can't go to that concept there. But this is really sort of building all this together, and this has applicability across a wide range of industries.
Yeah, I mean, there was the hack last year that occurred. Multiple restaurants, even government institutions and things like that weren't able to do payroll. And they also weren't able to do transactions with credit cards. You'd go in and they'd be like, either they'd take cash or they'd have to write everything down, which you don't want them writing down your credit card number, things like that. So having those mitigation plans, I think, is really, really important and critical nowadays.
What can companies do to prepare themselves for DORA before it comes into effect on January the 17th?
Besides understanding what your traffic like is in flight, what that path looks like through the network and having that service baseline, I think it's also important to think about things like data sovereignty, movement of data, where your data's at and how it's being stored and what those structures look like and how that aligns with your business. Being able to identify those anomalies, because again, if you don't have a baseline, how do you identify an anomaly in the actual service itself on that end-to-end service delivery chain? And then really the importance of just a comprehensive view of the end-to-end digital service chain and being thoughtful about automation of services, third-party services, of how, what your peering is. I think the other thing it allows you to do is to iterate on your best practices, to actually think about it more not as best practices, but better practices, how to make your organization better, how to create better visibility within IT operations itself by just having the telemetry and the insights to provide that foundation for them so they can launch into how to take things and automate those services when alerts occur and also just spot those anomalies and quickly respond to them. Ultimately, I think the main thing is if I get an alert, the first time I get the alert, I might manually go do it. But where you really want to get to with alerting is automating the alerts as much as possible to prevent that human interaction. And, as Mike indicated earlier, a lot of times these route issues that occur, it might not be a hijack. It could be just a human fat finger that occurs that takes an entire region down, for example, or a service.
And that baseline is critically important. That picture paints 1,000 words. As you said, I understand what the anomaly is because it's changed there. But, and again, something you said there in terms of that best practice or better practices, there's optimization, that continuous improvement. This gives you an opportunity, not necessarily to clean house, but to be able to understand what it is. So you can say, okay, here is a bottleneck in our process, or here is a single point of failure. So you can actually start to plan around it before something is catastrophic or takes you offline. And you start to say, what's it make sense from a redundancy perspective? Do we put in another component here? Is our backup circuits going to be able to cover the amount of data? Sort of how much data do we want to be able to transfer and things like that? And then also in terms of understanding, we talked about that service delivery chain, but understanding what components in there. There may well be another component in there that it's not that you weren't aware of that it existed, but it could be you didn't realize how critical it was, or was this single point of failure in there? So again, this gives you the opportunity to understand how things are put together as a service, not just individual components.
An additional thing that's really become very popular nowadays is like chatbots, for example, right? And those are being included into the web page or the application itself. And that's a whole other service now that's created another layer of complexity of things that need to be monitored and managed to assure that service. Because if you have a chatbot that goes haywire, has hallucinations, or is getting data from a different direction than you expected, that's going to have a really negative outcome on your customer base and your brand.
And absolutely. And it's also, again, it's understanding those, because you might not think that's a dependent thing. But if that breaks, as you said, apart from the hallucinations or the information, this can stop the whole page rendering, potentially. So all of a sudden, we've had a failure for something that's seemingly disparate, but it is actually a dependency.
Yeah, I was working with one financial institution in the States, and we traced their chatbot. It was taking their page an extra, I want to say 10 seconds to load, and the chatbot was actually coming all the way across the US, and they were located on the West Coast, and they could have just had it hosted on a cloud provider on the West Coast, and it would have been 10 milliseconds.
And post-January 17, what will companies have to do to ensure they continue to meet the enhanced requirements imposed by DORA?
There's a lot of things going forward that financial institutions are going to need to do to take responsibility for that digital resilience and working into those better practices where you start to iterate on here's how that service is working and how can I make it better. Some of that's going to be analysis of hearing, finding bottlenecks within their institutions themselves that they might not have been aware of. And that's a continuous process. It's something that you continually do. And then as well, I think just testing your failover of services, as Mike mentioned, maybe your backup circuit doesn't have the right amount of bandwidth. Maybe it actually isn't weighted properly to fail over even. I had an example where we did a network. I didn't, but one of my peers did some network maintenance. They failed over to the backup circuit and forgot to fail back to the primary circuit the next day. The backup circuit really wasn't designed for business services. It was just for whatever the minimum amount of traffic we could put through it. That was a rough day because, of course, that engineer went home and was asleep and turned their phone off, and we had to troubleshoot and figure it out. And if we would have had ThousandEyes, we would have known right away that that circuit hadn't been failed back. So things like that, I think, will help a lot with visibility and creating those processes and putting them in place. Again, automation, I think, starts to feed into these things as well, create that continuous improvement and optimize the overall service delivery. Knowing where your services are, that they're hosted in the right locations, and even optimizing them if they're not is another thing. As I mentioned with the bank that was pulling their entire chatbot across the US, if they would have just had a simple test, they would have known. And before they even went live with the chatbot, they could have fixed those things.
Yeah, and it's optimizing not just that delivery, like say to go forward to do the functional components, but even consider optimizing, automation, but also how do you fail over? Do we do a forced failover? Do we do a graceful failover? Because these have different implications on terms of how we manage the data. So there's all these things that have to be considered. Again, the backup circuits or the backup systems, you're also going to have to continuously test these. It's no good having it in place. And then, like you say, one day it's not enough bandwidth or a switch over. Again, example of this, we see often is that we'll have backup generators for data centers, but they've been primed, ready to go, but then there is no diesel in them or they don't kick over. So that's a failure there. We're not necessarily talking about the infrastructure there, but even consider that on a circuit point of view. Is that circuit, is it running a high error rate? Is it, as you said, passed through a different country? Have we changed the peering process on that backup circuit? Is it going to be available? So this is going to require that constant testing, not just of your primary environment, but also what you consider to be your backup or your mitigation environment.
So I guess that the final message on DORA is that once you get to January the 17th, you've not just ticked a box and you're done with it. It's a process of continuous monitoring and improvement to meet the requirements.
Absolutely. From an IT operations standpoint, I think it's always good to show your management that your team's doing an awesome job. And if the network doesn't go down, then people don't complain. Not that you want to take your network down, but being able to show that it's healthy all the time is a good thing.
So thanks to Bernie Clairmont for helping us work through DORA. Now we move on to the recent outages that Mike has observed. And we're starting with the Bank of Montreal website, which went down for a period on October the 23rd. Explain what happened here, Mike.
This was an impact to its online banking. As you said, it was October 23rd. It was around 2.5 hours. The first thing I should say here is it actually just impacted the online banking itself. So ATM transfers, people using to pay money on that banking app appear to all be functioning correctly. So that starts to tell us a couple of things that were going on there. So it actually lasted around 2.5 hours. And what the customer was seeing was this 500 internal server error. So when we actually look at it, we saw sort of internal server and sort of timeouts from there. What we actually saw when we were looking at the test, as I said, we saw these 500 errors and we saw then we were getting to the front door effectively so we could see that service. But then we saw something in the back end. The fact we're seeing a 500 error is indicative of I'm getting a server-side response. So it's saying I've got an internal server error. I can't actually process it. Something in the back end. Again, coming back to this fact that other services were working, the mobile application was working and the ATMs are working, which effectively are sort of calling from the same back-end systems, is indicative that we're actually looking at something that was just serving this web online server itself.
You could argue this is good resilience from the bank, allowing customers to still transact when the website faltered.
Yeah, absolutely. We're talking about the sort of web browser. So in effect, we talked about this reducing the impact. We're looking then at a small group of users or a smaller group of users that potentially we lost entire services. And again, probably most critical, you'll think about that. And we're talking about security, cyber attacks. Our back-end data, at that point, we're making the assumption that isn't impacted whatsoever.
And this was the second outage to hit the bank in recent months. The previous outage in May caused by a false alarm?
Yeah, a false alarm in a data center where they had this issue. We're talking about a false alarm. It actually then started to shut down some of the systems, or we had some sort of mitigation taking place within the physical data center itself. Now, again, we're talking about financial institutions, so we have these data residency concerns. So this is why we're looking at a data center there. In that case, because we're looking at the back-end data center, that would have been more widespread because we're looking at accessing the systems. Again, we're dealing with redundancy, so not all racks or everything would have gone down, but we're talking about impacting that back-end system. The key there is from a user perspective, it just looks the same. I don't know whether it's that side or that side. All I get is I can't actually use the application. So this is then why, as an organization, you want to be able to understand that service delivery chain. So you can go back and say, this is what it is. These are the steps we're taking, and announce what's happening.
Microsoft has released a video incident report on an Azure outage that occurred mid-September, which we covered in a recent blog. Tell us what we've learned from the report, Mike.
I wanted to pull this up really because this was actually a very good retrospective it went through. So apart from actually confirming what we'd actually said when we went through in the original blog, it also started to reveal some interesting next steps and sort of things we can actually learn from there. So just as a refresh of this was for the Azure Virtual Desktop users. It was various US regions and they experienced failures to access a list of available resources. So this wasn't for existing. If you actually had that system coming up, is when you wanted to do a new system. The problem was attributed to a degradation with a SQL database that was storing the configuration data and associated with that process that replicates the configuration from the primary database to these multiple secondary databases, or the secondary copies, I should say. Now, so why that becomes important is because those various components inside start to sort of make the process. And if we actually look through what they were talking about, and what I wanted to pick out here is in this retrospective when they go through, it was sort of decision making they made when they've gone through there. So there's a couple of things. They actually put out the information on the status page. So they have the internal admin functionality, which is not behind a paywall, but it's behind an admin wall. So they were constantly updating the customers on that. But they also decided to put it on the status page, which is publicly facing. They've actually come back and said, now, whether that was actually the right thing to do, they're not sure. They're looking to review that in the future, which kind of sort of goes back to some of the stuff we're talking about status pages. If I was a customer, I'd have access to the information because I have an admin console, assuming I could get to my admin console. In this case, I could have done, but we've had other situations where it's down, so we can't actually get to there. So that was actually interesting, sort of, how we do that, what independent visibility becomes then important to understand how of those. So, we're talking about this, if I've got a third-party system. If I was actually using some component, again, in this case, we're talking about the VDI, and spinning up these new instances. If I was actually, if it was thinking about another organization where I was using a third-party dependencies that was in something that was behind a wall, unless I understood how my things work together, I wouldn't actually see there. The other part of this retrospective was that they also conducted a review of the architecture. We were talking about this concept of I might want to pull functional areas apart. So we have a different component in a different area because that's how it's actually served. So when actually looking at the overall service delivery chain to understand which part they could do to keep high availability. So at the moment, they had this sort of graceful failover where they failed over a system. But because we then had this buildup of load, what occurred then was this situation where the services weren't available and we effectively got a backlog. So the outage or the delay or the impact to users was greater. So one of the things they're considering was basically, do they go from a graceful failover to a forced failover, which is going to be much quicker, but it then also has the ability then or potential to damage the data, which means you restore it afterwards. But in their eyes, then what they're doing is they're maintaining this high availability. They're keeping the system up. They're keeping their users. They can actually spin sort of stuff up. And they do write an awful lot of telemetry in this process. So, and this is this point of doing copying. Do I copy to a secondary server? Do I do this copy across there? Because we can retrieve it later on. It's almost becomes a batch process. Do we need that in real time? So they're then considering all these types of things. So there's obviously going to be trade-offs in what they do. But what was really interesting is that they're considering this whole holistic service delivery chain. So they can understand if I make a change here, what is the outcome I want to achieve? Do I want to achieve a greater availability? Do I want to maintain performance? Is there other considerations we need to take into place? And they're looking at that from a point of view. This is why I found it sort of very interesting to go through their analysis.
A power outage hit Google's cloud services in Europe for a large part of the day on the 24th of October. Tell us what happened with this one, Mike.
So this is Google's Cloud Europe West 3 C zone, and they experienced this disruption. It actually lasted quite a long time. It was around 7.5 hours. It affected the services that included some compute engines, some cloud, some publishing, some data flow, and some Google Kubernetes engines itself. So again, we're talking about one particular zone or one particular region, one zone within a region, I should say there. The preliminary analysis actually attributed this to a power failure and a cooling issue, impacted just a portion of that zone. And this sort of is reflective then of a number of common power loss scenarios we're seeing with cooling issues. And what happens in these situations, it's not like just as a power failure. We get a power failure, we then have UPS kicks in. So, the idea of a UPS is one, we can obviously maintain the power. We have a generator that comes in to sort of take that to smooth the power out. But you also have this potential, if we do have a UPS, we don't have sufficient power to maintain it, we can do a graceful shutdown of the rack or the area or those types of things. But when you get a situation where the power failure impacts the cooling system, you almost don't know until it's too late. So what happens is the heat rises, and then you can also start to cause damage on the components within the rack themselves. Remember, even though we're talking about the cloud, there's hardware components involved underneath here. And when that happens, you get an ungraceful shutdown. When we get ungraceful shutdowns, you might not necessarily damage the integrity of the infrastructure or the integrity of the data. But what it does mean is that often bringing that stuff back online takes much longer. So not only do we actually have to be able to fix the cooler system to make sure we have that coming back on, so we have the ambient temperature, so we can continue to work in there. Effectively, I might have to bring the services up and then shut them down again to bring them up in a specific order to make sure that I don't miss things. And this obviously can sort of elongate the outage period.
Is it comparable to a PC crash, where if you suddenly smack into the infamous blue screen of death, the PC has to go through various recovery processes before it reboots?
It is. It's exactly the same. That's a really good way to actually think about it, because once it's actually sort of shut down, it is, as it says on the label, it's ungraceful. So the PC goes through all these checks, and it's doing that to protect itself. So you'll see this in a lot of compute infrastructure. If something goes down and it's not expected to be powered off, we go through the standby process, or the bringing it back online will always take a bit longer because it has to do checks. Going back to my days as an electrician, if we turn the circuit on and there's a component on there starting to glow, then we don't want to damage the whole circuit board. This is the whole point of having resistors and transistors in the circuit boards themselves. Showing me age there. But so they can protect it. And this is the same when we're talking about these components. We're not just testing the components, we're protecting the data, we're protecting sort of the arrays and everything within the system itself.
And finally, Mike, the Internet Archive has been under repeated attack recently. Tell us about how the organisation is responding to that.
So the Internet Archive and the Wayback Machine, which actually is sort of storing all this data, I think something goes back as far as 1994. So before I was born, starts to sort of show all this this data where you can actually go and retrieve the DVDs or the VHSs or the Betamax tapes, this type of thing there. The way they're actually structured, this is a non-profit organisation, and they experienced like multiple days of DDoS attacks in early October. So this wasn't the first attack, as you alluded to there. But because of the frequency of it, it was actually significant. And what they actually did then, they sort of saw that and they sort of slowly took the services offline for upgrades to protect them. And then following the attacks, they started to slowly restore them. Then what we actually saw again, sort of just after this, was again a further attack. And this manifested itself in sort of a high spike in loss rate. And we also then sort of saw reduced load time. So again, we were seeing what they were talking about, where they actually sort of took the stuff offline. And when we saw the reduced load times, what we're talking about is, so the loss rate is seen at the forwarding point, the last point going into the Internet Archive's web servers. And then what we started to then see was, as the service came back online, I had a reduced page load time. So again, less components on there. What that meant is I couldn't actually retrieve information from the back end. So the lights were on effectively, but I couldn't actually get to the system. So this follows a sort of a pattern we've seen for some of these other organizations where they have been attacked, they've recognized the attack, and the safest way for them to do that is sort of take it offline while they actually sort of do the repairs and bring things back up. We talked about these various mitigations, and that's the way they do that. And again, this sort of showed up quite clearly when we were going through and looking at this data.
And that's our show. Please like and subscribe. We really appreciate it, and not only does this ensure you're in the know when a new episode's published, it also helps us to shape the show for you. You can follow us on X at @ThousandEyes, or send questions or feedback to internetreport@thousandeyes.com. Until next time, goodbye.